And just to say a word of introduction about my colleague, Brother Kevin Cawley. Kevin is a member of the Admin Rights International team, and he's based in New York, and he represents us at the UN in New York. And he serves on several committees that work at the UN in New York, Committee to Stop Trafficking, and a group called the Mining Working Group, and also Religious at the UN. So Kevin is very active in these many groups. His concerns are really about care of the earth and the environment. And indeed, how does the care of the earth and the environment sometimes interact with the rights of the child? And last month at the Human Rights Council, he made a statement about the effect of climate change on the rights of children, particularly children under the age of 5. So another interest of his is the Laudato Si document from the Pope back in 2015. And he works on the Laudato Si action platform for the Congregation of Christian Brothers. Kevin's background as a Christian brother is in education, and he's worked in all levels of education up to university level. And he produces a very fine newsletter every month called Carbon Rangers, which he may tell you more about in the course of his presentation. He's been very faithfully producing that newsletter since 2008. And I think at the moment it has over 600 subscribers. So Kevin, we look forward to what you're going to say today. And I'm just going to share my screen for one moment before I pass over to Kevin. And there you see the 4 sessions we've had in this particular Zoom series. And you see that we've moved from human rights and advocacy into looking at how do we engage with the human rights system. Then we had a session talking about the SDGs and advocacy. And now today, Kevin is bringing together care of the earth, Laudato Si, and the SDGs. So you see from these 4 sessions, you've got a flavor of the work of the Admin Rights International team. Human rights, advocacy, SDGs, climate change, Laudato Si, care of the earth. These are the items that really kind of inspire our work and that we pay attention to in our advocacy. So Kevin, over to you for the presentation.
Well, thank you very much. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever we are. And thank you for the introduction. Thank you, Kevin, and thank you, Tino, for helping us get started here. As you heard, I'm Brother Kevin Cawley. I'm based in New York at the UN at headquarters, and I've been with Admin Rights International since 2006. Today's presentation is, as you see on the title there, The Crisis in the Natural World and Faith Responds. One of the things that's happening is we want to remind ourselves that, yes, we're on the planet Earth, and as the Latin inscription there says, sic vos non vobis, for you, but not yours. So we have to remind ourselves that we have to take care of this planet Earth. That's from an Apollo moon expedition from way back when we were starting to find our way around. We have a note here that this is Arizona, USA. Time and temperature, 6:37 p.m., 122 degrees Fahrenheit. That's last year. And that translates to 50 Celsius, if you're wondering what is that all about. So that's an indicator of where we're headed. We need to pay attention now as to how we avoid that. We have a carbon story. There's 3 numbers that we need us to remember. And I remind you again about Tino's admonition at the beginning. You're not trying to take down all the data, but just sort of let it happen to you and get a sense of it. So the 3 numbers in the carbon story, the first number is 2 degrees Celsius. That's the Paris limit, the upper limit of what we think is the most dangerous number we have. And basically, we're trying to keep the global warming under a 2-degree increase. We're at 1.1, I think, at this point. So there's a 2 degrees. That's the first number. Second number, 565 gigatons of CO2. That's the carbon budget for the 2 degrees. If we burn 565 gigatons around the planet, we will have used up our budget and we will be pushing past the 2-degree limit on our increase in temperature, which is a very dangerous point. The third number is the most important one for us. 2,795 gigatons. This is what the oil companies know they have. So they have reserves which are 5 times approximately the number of gigatons of carbon that we are really allowed in our budget. That's a scary number because basically they're going to dig it up and sell it to us unless we find a way to get off fossil fuels. That's our challenge. We have some help. Here's the help that we're going to talk about today. Laudato Si on Care for Our Common Home. That's 2015. That's the Pope's encyclical. We have UN Sustainable Development Goals. SDGs is the acronym. Also 2015, Paris Climate Accord. 2015. There's a pattern here. And then recently we've had the IPCC, AR6. Now that's another UN acronym, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and report number 6, April. It just came out a few weeks ago, and they're telling us the science about what's happened in terms of the atmosphere. Laudato Si on Care for Our Common Home. Pope Francis let us know it's his hope that this letter is added to the body of the church's social teaching, and we hope, as he says, that it can help us to acknowledge the appeal, immensity, and urgency of the challenge we face. It's in 6 chapters. First chapter, what is happening? There's always a good place to start. Pope is a very practical man. What is happening? And then we go forward to the gospel of creation. It's based on, certainly on a scriptural basis for what creation is about. And in a sense, it's the first gospel, the gospel of creation. Then the human roots. What's causing this problem? And Pope Francis has identified it as human activity. We have integral ecology, that we have to figure out a way to put this all together so that we work together to solve the issues. Then he offers us some lines of approach and some action steps. And finally, he talks about the spirituality of this enormous project. And it's talking about their ecological education. That's how he divides up the work of Laudato Si. He makes it clear that it's not just an ecological approach, but it's also a social approach. This is not just an ecological encyclical. He's talking about justice. It must integrate questions of justice in debates on the environment so as to hear both the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. That's in paragraph 49. That's the main message I think we can take away from Laudato. We have a picture there of St. Peter's with a large image of a butterfly helping us understand. We also have to talk about water because this is an issue that's going to be with us because the water won't be with us. That's a big challenge. 70% of our planet is underwater. But in terms of fresh water, we have a problem because only 0.03% of all that water is accessible and drinkable. It takes 3 million gallons of that water to raise a cow to make beef. It takes 4,000 gallons of that water to make 1 hamburger. By the time you figure out what it costs to feed the animal and bring the animal to maturity and then have it processed and brought to your plate. Lots of water. And even just our clothing, 2,900 gallons to grow the cotton for 1 pair of blue jeans. By 2030, half the globe could be facing water scarcity. So it's another remarkable factor that we need to pay attention to. We're not always aware of it unless we're in a place where water is hard to come by. I think those of you who might be in the African continent have a good sense of that, much more so than those of us in the developed world. Laudato gets 47 mentions. Pope Francis talked about it a lot, the lack of access to clean drinking water, indispensable for human life and for supporting terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems. So he's aware of it, and he knows it's also going to be a challenge for food production because of drought and disparities in water availability, and he calls it water poverty. So Francis is on the case. We know there's a human right to water. The UN talks about it. That stat is up there for you, but you don't have to remember that one. But just understand the UN has talked about this and made the case that at the bottom there, 2.5 billion people live without basic sanitation. So a whole set of issues around the water question. In 2015, Pope Francis came to the UN Now, remember, 2015, he had just issued his encyclical in May. He came to New York that September and addressed the UN and made a great impression. And the day he came and spoke to the UN, he left the UN after his presentation. He went off to Philadelphia, but the UN kept working. And that afternoon, they passed the Agenda 2030, Sustainable Development Goals. So part of his visit was encouraging them in that work. We know that it made an impression on the UN. That's a picture there of Macharia Kamau, the Kenyan ambassador at the time. He was the chair of the Sustainable Development Goals process from 2012 to 2015. I was at many of those meetings. Imagine that, a 3-year meeting with 90 countries in the room from time to time. And he came in at the tail end of that process to remind us that the work was really, really significant as we're finishing up. And he brought with him a copy of Laudato Si. Then that's something you don't see at the UN. You don't see people bringing in religious leaders. It's always an issue for the UN to have religious people. But he talked about it and he said, I want everybody to read this document. I've given it to my staff. It's very important. We have inequality all over. Here's Sao Paulo, Brazil. We have inequality in Hong Kong. These are just some samples. Obviously, we have inequality in many places. These are just placeholders for today as we try to get a sense of what it looks like in different parts of the world. There's an overview of Mexico City. We think there's about 20 million people in Mexico City. You can see they're really crowded together, and I think it's hard to find in that picture even a single tree. And those of you who are familiar with rural parts of India know what this is, communal well. So basically the poor of the world are suffering all the time. This is a quick poster of the Sustainable Development Goals. You see there are 17 of them. They have small pictographs there to help us find our way forward. We won't be able to talk about all of them today, but you have a sense of them. And these are all available in the resources at the end of the process today. Tino will supply you with some additional ways to find out more about all of this material. We broke them out here into a 3-part graphic. At the bottom, the biosphere, the land and the water. The middle part is society. You can see you have the end poverty, you have energy issues, you have quality education, gender equality, and the top section there on the economy, you have jobs and you have equality there, and the consumption and production cycle. And at the very top, 17, is partnerships for the goals in terms of how do we pay for this. That's the real issue in this case. This summer, they're going to be reviewing a set of goals at the UN in what they call the high-level political forum. These are the goals that the UN is posting up for our conversation this summer. You have number 4, quality education, number 5, gender equality, number 14, life below water, number 15, life on land, and number 17, the partnerships for the goals. These are the ones that they're going to focus on this summer in July at the UN headquarters. We know that inequality is a concern of Pope Francis in the encyclical, and we know that 8 men own half the world's wealth. That's a disturbing fact that comes to our mind when we look about and say, what's wrong with what's happening? 8 men own the same wealth as the 3.6 billion people who make up the poorest half of humanity. There is something wrong with that picture. Laudato talks about it, and also the SDGs. So here's a slide that talks about Laudato's echo in the SDGs on reducing inequality. And they have targets for each of these goals. Target 10.1 is reduce income inequalities. Target 10.2 is promote universal social, economic, and political inclusion. And target 10.3, ensure equal opportunities and end discrimination. So you can see equalities gets broken out into several parts. The global inequality and the climate, we have some options now. We can talk about mitigation. We can change behavior to end the warming if we work hard and get it done in a hurry. That's basically avoiding the unmanageable. We need to make sure we don't go above the 2 degrees Celsius ceiling. And actually for many countries, especially small island states, 1.5 degrees is already too much. So mitigation, avoid the unmanageable. The other option is adaptation. You learn to live with climate change. And in that case, you're managing the unavoidable. Whatever happens between mitigation and adaptation, we know that there will be tremendous suffering. We talked about SDGs. This is one that we're going to look at quickly. Quality education. That's always been a feature of Human Rights International in terms of equality education and the right to education. We need to make a point at this juncture. Sadly, COVID-19 has wiped out about 20 years of education gains. Again, this is a lot of data. It's going to be available for you in the slides. And we have goal number 5, achieve gender equality and empower all women and girls. So they're related, the education and the gender equality, 4 and 5. And you can see here, women's participation in decision-making is crucial for COVID-19 response and recovery, but gender parity remains far off. Even at the UN, when we went to the COP26 conference in Glasgow with everybody trying to talk about how do we go forward on saving the planet and solving the climate crisis, only 16% of the representation was female. So we don't have equal participation, even at the UN, who's pushing for it. And reminder that the Laudato Si document is available. You can easily get it, but if you click on the Vatican Library, you can get a copy on a PDF. You don't even have to buy the encyclical book, and you can find your way through. I'm going to stop now for a few minutes. I think, Tina, we might. Thank you very much. Here's where we left off, and we'll pick it up again with Francis. That's his the copy of his encyclical letter, and we're now going to move to our presentation. When Francis put Laudato Si in front of the world in 2015, he talked about water a lot, and as we said, it's part of our story today, and it's an enormous concern for him as an essential feature of what was going on at the time. And I'll also remind people that it was not obvious to the world that that was a question. He was ahead of everybody, in a sense, on talking about it and bringing it to our attention. The SDGs added a goal on clean water and sanitation, goal number 6. So we know it's part of the story now. Goal number 7 is related to what we talked about before about poverty and energy equality. And it's ensure access to affordable, reliable, sustainable, and modern energy for all. This has really come up now in a terribly frightening way because of the war in Ukraine and the prospect that energy, which is in the form of oil and gas, is basically funding the campaign of Russia, because that's where they're making all their money. And Europe is depending on the energy from the gas and oil from Russia. So that's a dilemma that we need to pay attention to for sure. And basically what you see there is a sort of an indication. The solution to our energy problems is really the ball of light that's hanging 93 million miles away in the sky. We call it the sun. That's where we have to go and figure out, that's where we should get our energy in the future, not burning fossil fuels. We need to scale up all that sustainable energy. And we also know that it's going to be a huge lift. So we'll have to pay attention to that one, particularly now in light of what's happening in Russia-Ukraine struggle. The poor suffer first. That's always been the case. And we have the list of difficulties here: climate change and sea level rise and severe weather, severe drought, desertification, deforestation, the privatization of water, there it is again, food insecurity, land grabbing, toxic dumping, extractive industries, mining, logging, drilling, and then species extinction. Food and fisheries in particular are under tremendous stress as we're going forward. All of this impacts poor people before it impacts the rest of us. But that's where we are. In terms of sea level rise, we have another problem entirely, because generally the people that are going to suffer from the sea level rise are not the people that put the carbon in the atmosphere to warm the planet. here are two maps. The left-hand map is Vietnam. You can see in the right-hand corner is the blue. That's the South China Sea, and this is the bottom of Vietnam. The blue coloring on the Vietnam map, part of it is the river system. You can see the two main rivers coming down, and you can see the blue overlay. That's the once-a-year high tide predicted by 2050. That is, the entire, half the country will be underwater once a year by 2050. That's the original projection. Sadly, on the right-hand side, same map, same Vietnam, but they fixed their projections with better satellites. And this is what they're telling us now. By 2050, at least once a year, Vietnam will have high tides from the South China Sea that will cover most of the country up to that black line at the upper left-hand corner. That's the border with Cambodia. A very disturbing fact of life if you're trying to be a leader in that part of the world. That's just one country, one example, sea level rise. It's going to be enormously challenging and enormously difficult because basically, where do those people go? The opposite problem, this is a picture of a dried out riverbed in Bangladesh, and those are sheep looking for something to eat and drink. So the other part of the problem is the drought and the drying up. So Francis talked about all of these issues in his encyclical, and he's again pushing us back and pushing us into the question of it's not just about ecology, it's about justice, debates on the environment. And again, the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor, number 49. In terms of what's the human element here, Francis is pretty direct. He says, many have accepted the idea of infinite or unlimited growth. But look what he says. This paradigm is based on the lie. Popes don't usually say that word in public, but he says it's based on the lie that there's an infinite supply of the earth's goods. And this leads to the planet being squeezed dry beyond every limit. Clearly, he's calling us out on how we're behaving and how we're living. Again, St. Peter's event not too long ago. The integral ecology is a frame that Francis has been using for a while. We're not faced with two separate crises, he's telling us in Laudato, an environmental crisis and a social crisis. But he said they're intermingled. It's one complex crisis, both social and environmental. He's ready to make us see that if we'll listen. We also know that there's a question of intergenerational justice. The children that follow us, the grandchildren and their children are all going to be looking back at this era and saying, basically, what did you know and when did you know it and what did you do about it? Even now, we can find ways to preserve land. This is a picture of the Delaware River, and it's only 90 miles from New York City, and it's still being preserved. So we know we can do it. We know we can do it. In chapter 6, he talks about ecological education and spirituality. That's a very long chapter, and it's full of Catholic doctrine, especially much more so than the first part, the first 5 chapters. It's more like a catechism there. And he's very clear that, yes, many things have to change, but it's the human above all. The human beings have to change. And one of the things he talks about is we lack an awareness of our common origin, of our mutual belonging, and of a future to be shared with everyone. That's in paragraph 202. We're getting up toward the ending parts of this encyclical now, when we're in the 202 range of paragraphs. He has a final question, which is a disturbing question. Is it realistic to hope that those who are obsessed with maximizing profits will stop to reflect on the environmental damage which they will leave behind for future generations? That's a provocative question. He does not answer that question. That's for us to answer. But you can imagine, just going back a few slides, what is the thinking, let's say, of the 8 men who have half the world's wealth? Are they thinking about anything but maximizing profits? It's a question that's a hard one, but we need to keep asking it if we're going to get somebody's attention at some point. There was a celebration after this encyclical. There are a number of people there, even from Iona College. They're not in the front row, but they came to St. Peter's Square. They're marching down that avenue there with their banners. That day, I think it was a Wednesday audience day, so he was out a little bit on the balcony even, and he was waving to the crowd. So they were very happy to be there and participating in the celebration. This is an interfaith group called Green Faith. You can see the different religions' symbols are on that banner. Many faiths, one planet. That's the way we have to go. It's a photograph now of what they call the pale blue dot. This is taken from Voyager 1 spacecraft. This is 1990. So we're talking, 32 years ago. That little tiny dot is us. As the Voyager was leaving the original part of its journey, they turned the cameras around and said, let's take a picture and see if we can see the Earth. And that's what they got, that tiny little speck. And as far as we know, that's the only place where life exists. Anything that ever happened in the history of the planet happened on that little dot. And anybody you know and love is on that dot. And anybody you who will be succeeded by is going to be on that dot if we take care of it. And the Voyager 1 kept going. By the way, it's still out there. And it will take another 30,000 years to leave this solar system. You can imagine that concept. And it's traveling at 17,000 miles an hour. Runs on plutonium now. It's in outer space. There's no gravity. It's just sailing along. But that's the immensity of the universe. And here we are, the little blue dot. So something to give us a perspective. This is a different person speaking now. This is from Thomas Berry, and he's talking about the time has come to lower our voices, to cease imposing our mechanistic patterns on the biological processes of the earth. It's time to resist the impulse to control, to command, to force, to oppress. And we have to begin humbly to follow the guidance of the larger community on which all life depends. So he's calling us back, very much language that would not be far from what Pope Francis has been using, to bring us to our senses, so to speak, to take better care of the planet. We're at a point, I think we can take a look at this and then we'll take a little break. This is Ipcc Policy Warnings from 2016. This is right after the Paris Agreement. And I'll draw your attention to the three colors. The green banner, the green goals, you can see it's coming up to the little thermometer. It's talking about 1.5 degrees. That's the original goal from the Paris Agreement. Let's try to keep it to 1.5. You can see it's bumping up against the 2 there. But that's what the Paris Agreement was about. Then the countries that signed the Paris Agreement went home to their countries and they all sat down and said, let's make a plan. We have to show that we're going to try to fix this. So they all wrote their proposals and came back to the UN with their proposals. And then the UN collected everybody's homework, basically. And then they looked at everybody's homework and said, okay, here's what happened. If everybody does what they promise about carbon, we'll end up at 3.3 degrees centigrade. Well, that's a disturbing outcome for when the homework gets checked by the UN, because we have to be down there at 1.5. And even everybody working hard and saying, well, this country's going to do that and this country's going to do this, we still didn't get there. If everybody does what they promised, we're still going to end up with a 3.3 increase. And worst of all, if we don't do anything, the yellow line, the business as usual, we're going to have a 4.2 increase. These are catastrophic numbers. If what's happening now with the storms and devastation and sea level rise is happening at 1.1, we don't want to even consider what might be happening at 3.3 or 4.2. So that's a very disturbing warning, and it's from 2016. 2016. So we already knew at that time that we were going to have a problem here. I think, Tino, I'll stop at this point, and we'll take a little short time to do a little maybe a chat thing. And we're back at our little graph, we showed you the 2016 IPCC. Remember, that's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. That's the group of scientists that tries to keep us informed about what is happening. So we're at that point when, let's take a look now. What's IPCC telling us now, 6 years later? And then what are the solutions? I noticed a couple of questions in the chat. What can we possibly do? So we're going to take a look now at the last section here on some of the ways we might go forward in this process. The Intergovernmental Panel delivered another report just April 4th and basically told us the time is running out. That's no surprise to anybody who's on this call, but it is important that we make a mark on it. I will give you this caution. The IPCC summary for policymakers called SPM, caution on this. The document itself, the IPCC, the whole thing is about 3,000 pages. So I'm sorry about that, but that's what they did. A lot of science. Then they made two summaries that were helpful. One was the summary for policymakers, and that needs approval of 192 countries. So what's happening with that? Well, the final text of this summary for policymakers gets massaged, that's the word we're using now, at the behest of several fossil fuel dependent economies and fossil fuel corporations. Sad to say, they actually got in the rooms where they were making the final edits on the text, and they changed a few things. The technical summary, which is another document, is much clearer and less muddled. So if you're a real fierce person for a deep dive, I recommend look at the technical summary. It's very clear, much more clear than the summary for policymakers. And again, most people don't have the time for that, but just so you have a heads up on it. I put some of those together. We're not going to do all the slides, but there's a sense, I think, that you should at least be aware of that. There's two ways of looking at this. One of the things that they tell us is that we're going to overshoot 1.5. That's pretty grim, I know, but that's what they're looking at if we don't change things in a hurry. The global emissions have continued to rise in the last decade, albeit at a slower rate. So we weren't as bad in the last 10 years. However, what's happened? We've had this terrible war in Ukraine from the Russian invasion, and that's caused a problem with supplies of fossil fuels to Europe. And the Americans in particular have decided we need to go and drill for more oil, which is the worst possible outcome. But we'll see how bad it gets. The likelihood of limiting warming to 1.5 has declined. So we're not doing well right now. And part of it has to do with the war. We'll have to figure out a way around that and get to renewable energy. We do know the solutions are getting cheaper. It is cheaper in some places to use solar and wind than it is to burn oil and gas. Carbon cutting and low emission technologies are becoming cheaper. The cost of solar, wind, and lithium batteries have fallen significantly in the last 10 or 12 years. So we know that that's possible. We can get better. And we know, electric vehicles are making a dent on the planet. We'll see how far that goes. The economic benefit of limiting warming to below 2 degrees is higher than the cost of action. That is what you pay. You might pay, let's say in your whatever country you're in, you might pay $100 million for electrification, but you'll save $300 million by not burning the oil. It's a simple math question at that point. There are solutions. Let's take a look at a few of them. A place that is not helping is the banking industry. There are still many countries are doing fossil fuel subsidies. That is, the countries in many cases are helping out the oil companies by letting them externalize their costs. So they're not making them pay for the fact that they're poisoning the atmosphere with methane. They're letting them, in a sense, pass on that terrible poison. Big banks are accelerating the climate crisis. They continue to lend money to fossil fuel companies. You saw that back in the beginning of this presentation at the very top. We talked about the fact that fossil fuel companies have 5 times as much oil in the ground that they know about already. And yet the banks are lending them more money to do what? To look for more oil. And we know we have too much oil now. We really can't burn, but there they are. And now there's talk of what they call technology solution, carbon capture and storage. There's not enough time to develop that technology. So those are delay tactics that are dangerous, and we should be aware of them. We do have a solution set offered by this group called Drawdown, drawing down the carbon. And it's a group of people, a group of science people and activists who worked under this man named Paul Hawken. They describe the history of each solution, the carbon impact, the relative cost, the path to adoption, and how it works. So that's a book that you could find on the internet and Google it. But for us, we're just going to look at a few. They have the 100 best solutions here for solving this crisis. Number one problem that they could solve right away, and which is the number one, the win, is refrigerant management. And everybody's probably scratching their heads. What is refrigerant management? All those air conditioners and all those cooling machines and all those freezers and refrigerators all have coolants in their systems. You can see the cables and everything running around. And the difficulty is that that gas gets in the atmosphere and it's warming the atmosphere. But if we can get rid of that bad gas, the hydrofluorocarbons, as they call them, we could save almost 90 gigatons of carbon every year. Remember the beginning we talked about 565 was our budget? We could save 90 gigatons of that by getting rid of these refrigerants. And their analysis talked about emissions reductions that can be achieved through the management and destruction of refrigerants already out there. We can go get all those bad ancient air conditioners and freezers and get the gas out and put it safely away. And then basically go back and fix the air conditioning business so that they're not putting out that kind of gas in the atmosphere and avoiding those leaks. And the net cost of $903 billion by 2050 if we don't do it. So that's a big threat. The issue, of course, is it's a paradox, right? The Earth is warming up. The planet is getting warmer. So people are getting more in need of air conditioning. So they get more air conditioners and then they heat up the planet with the gases from the air conditioning. It's a terrible, vicious cycle. We have to get past it. But in terms of drawdown, that's the number one thing we could do in terms of a big savings on carbon and a big savings on the costs of all that bad leakage of those refrigerants. The number two solution to the planet's problems is onshore wind. Now, these are those big turbines. You can see there's a picture here of, you can see the man who's working on it, the little guy in the left-hand corner. These are enormous machines, and they're obviously showing up everywhere. I don't know anybody who's in any country who doesn't have at least once or twice seen one of these giant turbines. But basically, it's working with wind power and it's saving electricity by storing it in the batteries. And also it's way, as we say, more efficient. And there's no carbon burned to produce the electricity. Obviously, they had to do some carbon intensive work to make that windmill sort of feature and make those big blades and transport it and the rest of it. But once it's running, they're not burning carbon. And that's a really big savings. And this is onshore wind, making a distinction here because offshore wind is also very good, but it's much more expensive to put turbines out in the ocean. There's so many other things you have to do. So wind turbine onshore is cheaper. You just need more land. And that's how that will work. It's number two in rank. It saves 84 gigatons of carbon. If you go right now, it says an increase in onshore wind from 3 to 4% of world electricity to 21% by 2050 could reduce emissions by 84.6 gigatons of carbon dioxide. Again, back to that original slide at the top of the show. 565 is our budget. We can save 84 gigatons if we push windmills, basically, get 20% of our electricity out of the wind, and we're going to save all those gigatons of carbon. So it's a good solution. Interesting one here, maybe you wouldn't have thought of this, educating girls. Educating women and girls would be a carbon reducer. Part of that is the doing of two things, basically influencing family size and global population. Educate the girls and give them family planning. We assume that these impacts result from 13 years of schooling, including primary through secondary education. And according to the UN UNESCO numbers, this is closing a gap of $39 billion. You could get everybody in all these countries basically through high school, 13 years of schooling. So a wonderful payoff, so to speak, in almost 60 gigatons of carbon, just by having the women educated and keeping the family size reasonable. Those are all things that could happen. A lot of times, as you know, if you're in a poor part of the world, for many young women, there aren't that many options. And often you have 12 and 13-year-old girls being pushed out of the house, find a husband, go have somebody else take care of you. Don't worry about school. You don't need school. You're just a girl. All those kinds of mental sets have to change. Back to, again, Francis talking about we need to change the human being. So there's another one. And in this case, we could save on our carbon budget. Solar farms are number 8. You can imagine that would be a help. Again, there's a wonderful source of energy 93 million miles away in the sky. We have to figure out a way to bring that energy down, and we don't want to burn carbon. So solar. Even here in Lake Titicaca, down in Bolivia, it's a reed house on a reed mat in a lake. But there is mama and her 2 girls, and she has solar panels. Why is that helpful? Because the solar panels can store energy. They can have light at night, and the girls can study and finish their schooling. So again, a combination of issues here. The solar power is not carbon intensive, and the girls are going to get an education. Rooftop solar gets 24 gigatons of carbon reduction. That's a good one. It's right now 0.4% of electricity. If we get it even up to just a little bit more, 7% by 2050, we can avoid 24.6 gigatons of emissions. So those are some samples of what we might be able to accomplish. And basically, we're trying to keep the whole show, so to speak, in a safe and just space for humanity. This is from Oxfam. You may know them. And the social foundation of life for humans is in the middle blue circle. What we need food and water and health and income and education, gender equality, social equity, energy, jobs, a voice, some resilience. That's where we can thrive. And we can all work together, and we can have a safe and just space for humanity with that social foundation. Basically, that's coming at us through the SDGs. And it's also a sustainable economic development. If we exceed, as we say, leave the donut, go outside the green circles, and you notice at the top, if we push out and change the climate, we push out on the other side and take up the fresh water, we mess up the land, we start to lose biodiversity, we start to push too much nitrogen and phosphorus into our agriculture. All of those things will exceed the boundaries of a safe and just space for humanity, and we don't want to go there. That's a good summary of what that might mean. And basically, the platform that Laudato Si is now pushed forward is how to engage where you are, which is what we all have to face into, right? We can't just say, well, I can't solve the problems of the world, but I can engage where I am. Here's some advocacy suggestions. And we said this once before, I think if you heard me speak, how does one person do anything? Well, one person stops being one person. First of all, join a group. The Catholic social teaching talks about see and judge and act. That's a good mantra to remember. If you're fortunate and you're in a place where your democracy is functioning, you can contact your legislature. Some places don't have that privilege. There are public actions you can take. You can do civil protest if you're fortunate, again, to be in a working democracy. You can write letters to the editor of the local paper. You can post bulletins on the internet. Prayer and fasting have never gone out of style, and they do make a difference. You can connect with the Laudato Si Action platform. There'll be a reference in the resources for you how to find that and how to get involved. I'd say keep learning and stay informed, and God bless you. Anybody who's on this call is basically doing that, keeping learning and staying informed. Again, Thomas Berry talks about what we can do for people, and he says the most valuable heritage we might provide is some sense of what he calls the great work, which is moving the human project from its devastating exploitation, which is where we are, to a benign presence. We've got to be better to the earth. And in a sense, he's predicting the care of our common home that Francis has talked about. We need to give young people the sense that there's some indication now of how the next generation can fulfill this work in an effective manner. We need to be better humans to have a better and safer planet. So that's the end of this part of the presentation. We certainly welcome comments and questions as we move out.